just 14, she thought of her room as a sanctuary, a private space she kept open for friends to leave her notes. It was a simple gesture, a teenage whim keeping her window unlocked, a habit she'd never questioned. Until that night. It was a quiet evening. Her family was out, leaving her alone in the house. As she sat watching TV, an urge tugged at her to prepare her softball gear, her new bat bag that she was eager to show off at practice the next day. She climbed the stairs quickly, her steps light and swift, mind focused solely on the bat she'd left on her bed. The hallway was dim, the shadows growing longer as the last of the daylight faded through the windows. A strange silence had settled over the house, a quiet she hadn't noticed before, and her footsteps seemed to echo as she approached her room. She thought of her window then, but only briefly, reassuring herself that her family's home was safe. Her hand rested on her bedroom door, and as she pushed it open, a slight breeze slipped out, brushing against her face like a whisper. She hadn't remembered leaving the window that wide open. It usually let in a soft draft, maybe just enough to rustle her curtains. But now, as she stepped further into the room, she felt an unsettling chill. She walked over to her bed, eyes on the bat lying there, its metallic surface glinting slightly in the dim light, her fingers wrapped around its handle with satisfaction. But the feeling of relief was short-lived. From somewhere behind her came a sound faint, almost imperceptible, but just loud enough to freeze her in place. It was a scraping noise, a soft rustling that seemed to creep from the window she'd left unlocked so often. Slowly, with a racing heart, she turned around, and that's when she saw him. A dark figure was crawling through the window, his movements slow and deliberate, one hand gripping the frame while the other reached inside, pulling his weight through with a menacing grace. She felt rooted to the floor, her legs heavy, her mind racing but her body unable to respond. The man was in, his shadow stretching long across her room as he straightened up, his face hidden in the shadows. He seemed to sense her presence, his head turning slowly in her direction, his gaze piercing even in the darkness. Her heart thundered painfully in her chest, each beat louder than the last, a relentless drum urging her to act. But she was transfixed, paralyzed by the figure that loomed just feet away. And then, almost as if instinct took over, her grip on the bat tightened, a surge of fear-fueled courage pushing her forward, the only thought in her mind, escape. In that suspended moment, she saw the intruder fully, a dark, shadowed figure, crouching on her windowsill, like some creature emerging from the night itself. His hands gripped a frame, pale and sinewy, fingers digging in as he hauled himself inside with quiet precision. He moved with a sickening slowness, as though savoring each second of his arrival. A chill ran down her spine, paralyzing her as she watched his every movement, too stunned to even breathe. The man slipped into the room, placing one foot, then the other, onto the floor, standing tall now in the darkening glow. His face remained obscured by shadows, his features difficult to make out, but his eyes gleamed with a dark intent, catching the faintest bit of light. There was something deeply wrong about his presence, a heaviness that seemed to cling to the air. It was as though he brought the very darkness with him, a kind of living shadow that pressed down on the room, amplifying every detail in her vision, every quiet sound. Her heart hammered violently, each beat echoing in her ears as she struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. This was supposed to be her space, her room, her refuge. And now, in the span of seconds, it had transformed into a place of silent terror. He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over her possessions, the scattered clothes, the softball trophies on her shelf, even the bat bag by her bed. It was as if he was taking stock of her life, marking each detail with a silent claim. Then his head turned, his gaze finally resting on her. His eyes glinted with an eerie curiosity, the kind that sends a primal chill through every nerve. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the bat, her grip trembling but firm. She could feel the rough handle pressing into her palm, grounding her just enough to push back against the terror clawing at her mind. In that moment, she realized there was no reasoning, no shouting that would help. There was only one choice: defend herself or risk becoming a victim. Summoning every ounce of strength she had, she raised the bat. Her breath hitched as she swung, each second stretching endlessly, until a deafening crack shattered the silence as the bat connected, sending him crashing to the floor. Time seemed to freeze as she watched the intruder collapse to the floor. The bat's impact had reverberated through her arms, sending a jolt up to her shoulders, but her grip remained firm. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths as she stood over him, her mind racing to process what had just happened. He lay sprawled on the carpet, face down and motionless, his form disturbingly lifeless. The only sound was her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears like a relentless drum. The silence in the room felt suffocating, pressing in from every corner as her gaze stayed locked on the intruder's still body. Had she really knocked him out? Was it over? She struggled to process it, a strange mix of relief and terror twisting her insides. But then a new thought clawed its way into her mind, seizing her with icy dread. What if he was only pretending? What if, at any moment, he would spring up and come after her again? Her hands began to tremble, but she forced herself to stay steady. She needed to act, needed to be certain he wouldn't get up again, wouldn't reach for her or the window. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee as fast as she could, but her body was frozen in place, every muscle tense, locked in this unyielding moment. With shallow breaths, she took a shaky step backward, eyes never leaving his form. Her fingers tightened even more around the bat's handle, her palms damp with sweat, as she prepared to swing again at the slightest movement. A sense of desperate determination welled up within her, overriding her exhaustion and fear. She knew she couldn't just leave him there, lying on her bedroom floor. But getting any closer was unthinkable. Finally, her gaze shifted to the door behind her, her only path to safety. She knew she couldn't stay in this room a second longer. She inched backward slowly, every step a gamble as she tried to keep her distance from him while making her way out. Her heart raced with every movement, the threat of him waking up and grabbing her sending her pulse into overdrive. When she reached the doorway, she turned, clutching the bat against her chest as she bolted down the hallway, not daring to look back. This was her chance, her only chance to escape. And she wasn't going to waste it. She bolted down the hallway, adrenaline surging through her veins as she left the darkened room behind. Each step was hurried, her breaths coming in panicked gusts as she fought to reach the staircase. The hallway felt unnervingly long, every shadow on the wall seeming to shift as she rushed past. Her grip on the bat was tight, her only comfort against the horrifying image that remained seared into her mind. The stranger lying still on her bedroom floor, as if waiting to lunge up at any moment. As she reached the top of the staircase, her foot missed a step. She lost her balance and tumbled forward, her ankle twisting sharply under her as she fell. Pain shot up her leg, white-hot and blinding, but the terror kept her moving. She bit back a cry, pushing herself up on her hands as she hobbled down the rest of the stairs, each step sending another sharp sting of pain through her ankle. But she couldn't afford to stop. Every instinct told her to get as far away as possible. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled toward the living room, searching frantically for her phone. The house felt unfamiliar in her panic, every shadow sharper, every sound amplified. The thought of him waking up, or worse, already following her, fueled her desperation. She could almost feel his presence behind her, closing in as she scoured the living room for her phone. Finally, she spotted it on the table. She limped over, snatching it up with trembling hands and quickly dialing 911. Her hands shook as she raised the phone to her ear, pressing it close as she waited. Every second stretched endlessly, her gaze darting between the staircase and the darkened windows, terrified he might appear at any moment. When the operator's voice crackled through, she barely managed to stammer out the words, her voice quivering as she recounted the horrific ordeal. "There's a man, he was in my room. I hit him, but I don't know if he's still there." Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to stay calm, her mind clinging to the one thought that kept her going: help was on its way. As she hobbled back, she braced herself against the wall, eyes trained on the dark hallway, waiting in terror for any sign of movement. She wasn't safe yet, but she was going to survive. The minutes felt like hours as she clutched her phone, waiting for the police to arrive. Every sound, the creak of the house settling, the faint hum of the refrigerator seemed amplified in the silence. She tried to steady her breathing, each shaky inhale feeling too loud, as if it might alert the intruder if he was still nearby. Her ankle throbbed painfully, a constant reminder of her frantic escape, but the thought of him lying there, somewhere in her house, kept her on edge. Against all logic, a gnawing worry crept into her mind. What if he'd disappeared? What if, in her panic, she'd imagined he was unconscious? She gripped the bat tightly, its weight both reassuring and unsettling. She had to be sure she couldn't just wait here, terrified, until the police arrived. Driven by a mix of fear and defiance, she limped toward the staircase, her heart pounding as she forced herself to retrace her steps. With every step, a new surge of dread pulsed through her. The house felt different, darker, as though shadows had crept in from every corner, warping the familiar space into something sinister. Her breathing slowed, each shallow breath echoing in her ears as she reached the top of the stairs, every nerve on high alert. As she approached her bedroom door, she could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. She steadied herself, bracing against the pain in her ankle, before gripping the doorframe and peering inside. The room was exactly as she'd left it, the window wide open, the curtains rustling slightly in the night breeze. Her eyes darted to the spot where she'd last seen him, her mind racing to piece together every detail. But the floor was empty, as if he'd simply vanished. A chill ran through her. Had she really knocked him out, or had he only been pretending? The thought gnawed at her, sending a fresh wave of fear through her. She scanned the room, her eyes tracing every shadow, every darkened corner, looking for any sign of him. The closet door stood ajar, a shadowed sliver of space that seemed to beckon her closer. She hesitated, her grip tightening on the bat as she edged forward, one agonizing step at a time. Her pulse thundered as she reached the closet, the silence in the room stretching on unbearably. She held her breath, barely able to move, and with a swift, shaky motion, yanked the closet door fully open, the darkness inside swallowing the last shred of her courage. But it was empty. Her eyes lingered on the shadows, waiting, but nothing stirred. Relief washed over her, cold and unexpected, leaving her both grateful and unsettled. She stepped back, her mind struggling to process the absence of the man she'd seen moments before. The police arrived shortly after, their presence breaking the oppressive silence. She gave them a description, her words tumbling out in a rush, each detail bringing back the terror she'd felt. They searched the house thoroughly, but he was nowhere to be found. That night, she locked every window, every door, but sleep eluded her. And as the days turned into weeks, the memory of that night clung to her, an ever-present reminder that she'd come face to face with something far more terrifying than she'd ever imagined, and somehow, she'd survived. In the days that followed, the terror of that night settled over her like a shadow, an invisible weight she couldn't shake. Every creak, every gust of wind outside her window felt like an echo of his presence. She would catch herself glancing over her shoulder, heart racing at the smallest sound, her mind constantly replaying that moment, the sight of him crawling through her window, his figure dark and sinister against the night. She'd done everything she could to feel safe again. The window that had once been left unlocked for friends' notes was now securely latched, bolted even, with a small dresser placed in front of it for extra assurance. But no amount of locks or barriers could erase the memory of his silhouette in her room, the gleam of his eyes as he crept forward. It had been her sanctuary, her space, but now it felt tainted, the shadows somehow darker, the air colder. She couldn't walk into her room without that same unease washing over her. She'd become hyper-aware of everything around her, scanning each corner, every shadow, as though he might somehow still be hiding there, waiting. And even when her parents tried to comfort her, assuring her he was gone, that the police had checked every inch of the house, she could only nod numbly. Because, deep down, she knew that he hadn't just left, he'd left an imprint, a scar that marked her every thought, every restless night. Sleep became an elusive escape. She would lie awake for hours, staring at the locked window, the memory of that night replaying like a twisted lullaby, each detail vivid and haunting. Sometimes, she could almost feel his presence lingering, a phantom lurking in the periphery of her mind. It was as though he'd left a part of himself behind, embedded in the walls, haunting her even in his absence. As she lay awake, clutching her bat beside her bed, she found herself consumed by a single thought: if she hadn't had that bat in her hand, she might not be here now. It was a terrifying realization, one that filled her with a mix of gratitude and dread. She knew that her life had changed forever that night, and though he was gone, his shadow would remain with her, a reminder to always lock the window, to never let her guard down again. 2 years later, the memory of that night remains, vivid and chilling, etched into her mind as if it happened yesterday. At 16, she's stronger, a little wiser, yet the experience still lingers like a shadow, always just out of sight but never fully gone. She's more cautious now, instinctively locking every window and door, double-checking each latch before allowing herself to relax, if only a little. The unlocked window, once a small act of trust and freedom, is a distant memory, replaced by layers of security and new routine she clings to like a lifeline. Though time has dulled the immediate fear, certain things never faded. Every so often, when she's alone, she'll feel a subtle prickle on the back of her neck, as if being watched, and every creak or sudden movement in her peripheral vision makes her heart skip a beat. The feeling of safety she once took for granted is gone, replaced by a heightened awareness, an instinct honed from fear. Sometimes, she finds herself replaying that night in her mind, wondering if she could have done anything differently. A small, lingering question gnaws at her: where did he go? Despite the police search and the comfort of her family, there's no denying that he vanished, leaving no trace behind. The lack of closure only deepens her unease, and she finds herself wondering if he'll ever return, an unwanted visitor lurking somewhere in the shadows, waiting for another opportunity. But she doesn't let fear dictate her life. She's taken up her bat again, swinging it with renewed purpose on the field, a symbol of both strength and survival. To her, it's more than just a piece of sports equipment now, it's a reminder of her courage, her will to fight and survive, even when faced with the unimaginable. As she stands on the field, bat in hand, she reminds herself that she was strong enough then, and she's even stronger now. The memory still chills her, but she has found a way to reclaim her life, turning the bat from a weapon of defense into a symbol of resilience. Though the shadows in her room may never fully leave her, she knows she can face them and anything else that comes her way. Even now, years later, she can't shake the memories of that night. In her quiet moments, when the world is still and darkness settles in, the details come flooding back, the sound of his movements, the cold stare as he crept closer. She's managed to move on, to build a life with layers of security and confidence she didn't have before. But no matter how much time has passed, the experience has woven itself into the fabric of who she is, a scar invisible to others but all too real to her. She still wonders, on occasion, what happened to him. The lack of answers gnaws at her, a silent reminder that sometimes threats don't disappear, they just lie dormant, hidden in the shadows. She'll find herself glancing over her shoulder on certain nights, her senses sharpened, half expecting to see a silhouette lurking in the darkness. Though the terror has dulled with time, it remains, a quiet vigilance that has reshaped how she views the world, and every so often, she finds herself running her fingers over her old bat, still resting in its bag. It's no longer just a piece of her childhood, it's a token of survival, a reminder that when faced with the unthinkable, she found strength she never knew she had. That bat saved her life, but the experience changed it forever. As she stands in her room, locking the window one last time before she turns out the light, she realizes that this story has no true ending. The fear may fade, but the memory, the lesson, will stay with her always. And perhaps, that's what keeps her safe now.